We'd all love to hit skip on our problems now and again, but using weed to deal with stress as a teen won't make your issues go away. That's because THC messes with parts of the brain responsible for fear and anxiety, making it even harder to manage them on your own. So even the smaller things can start to feel difficult to handle. Learn better ways to deal with stress at mindovermarijuana.com. That's mindovermarijuana.com.
Sponsored by the California Department of Public Health.
Oscast.
Hello world, I'm Tim Whiffen and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In late May 2019, the European parliamentary elections were held. This is the 9th such election to be held for the European Parliament since its founding in 1979. The European Parliament was formed in order to put together the ultimate political integrative mechanism, signalling to the world that the individual nation-states that made up the European Union would form a cohesive, common approach to political affairs. After World Wars I and II tore Europe apart in two great spasms orgiastic violence, one can certainly sympathise with this lofty aim. However, even after the European Parliament's creation, national ambitions, identities and interests were only ever imperfectly tempered. The last round of European parliamentary elections showed that nationalism is making a comeback. Those in favour of Brexit on the UK side of the ledger won hugely. Northern Italian nationalists won in Italy, signalling that a divided Italy may be on the cards in the medium term, and while there were some notable defeats for nationalist parties, overall they are a growing, permanent presence in the European political space. Upon scanning recent geopolitical articles on social media, Dr. John Bruni came across a piece written by a colleague and part-time contributor to Sage International Australia, Professor Julian Lindley-French. In this piece, Professor Lindley-French argues that a coup has taken place in European establishment with the appointment of the German Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen as European Commission President, replacing Jean-Claude Juncker, while International Monetary Fund head Christine Lagarde was appointed head of European Central Bank. For more information, Professor Lindley-French's article can be seen on the SIA website. Today we'll analyse this fascinating observation. From the UK, we are joined by Professor Lindley-French. Julian is Vice President, Atlantic Treaty Association, Senior Fellow of the Institute of Statecraft, Director of Europa Analytica, and Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, National Defence University, Washington, D.C. Also in the studio are John Bruni and David Olney. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on the Oscast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. I'm joined in the studio by Dr. John Bruni and David Olney.
Hello, Tim.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Welcome, Julian. And if I may start off with the first question, what was your observation following on from the European parliamentary elections? I mean, from your perspective, what did they really mean?
Well, there is a profound split, a three-way split within the European Union. At the one end, there are the federalists who believe that the European Union can only survive by moving inexorably forward to some kind of European superstate. In the middle, there are the power states of the European Union, which are really France and Germany, around which this thing orbits, which don't really want a European superstate, but they do want to exert a certain amount of control. And then the third element, which was strengthened significantly in the European parliamentary elections, are this Eurosceptical group emerging in many European countries, which really wants to roll back the competencies of the European Union and the power of Brussels. Some want to simply give more power back to their national capitals. Others want to end the whole project itself. So, this is a profound moment in the story of European integration, and the elections reflected that.
What do you make of the so-called right-wing nationalist insurgency in the EU space? I mean, is this a real thing, or is it just media hype?
Media hype. I mean, there are right-wing nationalists, there's no question about that. But a lot of it is a reflection of the frustration of millions of ordinary, decent Europeans who are by no means extreme left or extreme right, fed up with the ability of the political mainstream in Europe to deal with the issues that matter to them, including security and defense, seemingly lost in a hyper-liberal fantasy about how society and the world is moving, hiding behind the mask of globalism. The simple reality is that the identity of most Europeans is firmly anchored in their nation states. And most Europeans still do not wish there to be an eroded nation state in favor of some vague entity called Europe. They're very happy that Europeans cooperate very closely with each other. They understand that Europeans should indeed cooperate closely with each other. But the legitimate focus of power, the democratic center of gravity of power in Europe remains national parliaments, national governments duly elected by the people of their countries.
Julian, you suggested in your recent piece, which we republished on the Sage International Australia website, that the appointment of German Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen as EU Commission President and the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, as the head of the European Central Bank represents a German-French coup. What do you mean by this? Doesn't the European Parliament rule for all of Europe?
Well, there was a profound belief amongst many in the European Parliament that the appointment of Jean-Claude Juncker as Commission President during the last round established the principle of what's called Spitzenkandidaten, that the President of the Commission would be appointed from the most powerful political group within inside the European Parliament, i.e. that the European Parliament would directly legitimize and thus appoint the head of the European Commission, because the point of the European Parliament is the reviewing body for the European government, the Commission. What happened instead was that the nation states, the member states, couldn't agree. And then France and Germany stepped in a very effective way, and not without reason, because the EU is drifting at the moment, to basically impose their candidates, von der Leyen on the Commission, which is the government side of the European Union, and Christine Lagarde and the European Central Bank, which is the money side of the Union, or to be more precise, the Eurozone, not the Union in its entirety. So you have this profound split between the federalists I talked about earlier in the European Parliament, many of whom are federalists, who see the European Parliament moving towards a center stage of power in Europe and gaining ever more control over such appointments, and the power states, most notably France and Germany, saying, no, hold on a minute, we need to control this thing, Berlin and Paris in particular, therefore our people go in. In the past, although there have been exceptions with, for example, Roy Jenkins from the UK when he was Commission President, Jacques Delors from France when he was Commission President, and to some extent Romano Prodi when he was President. But traditionally, Commission Presidents have come from the medium to smaller sized member states. Why? Because the essential mechanism and purpose of the EU is to offset the power of the bigger states and exaggerate the power of the smaller states to avoid extreme state behavior of the kind we've seen in Europe in the past century. This was a clear move by Germany and France to reassert the Franco-German axis and to establish again their control over the project.
Julian, is this really then the case that the centrists in the European Parliament got annihilated in the elections? So the two states that most completely represent that centrist view took us back from sort of federated politics back to state domination? Is this the Germans and French saying they want this centrism that was going nowhere back? Or do they want a centrism that has a slightly different direction to move forward? How do they define their centrism?
Well, you put your finger on the essential paradox at the heart of the European project. I wouldn't say that it's as extreme as the French and Germans basically taking power back for the sake of it. But they do want to ensure that neither extreme nationalists nor extreme federalists gain power. They're particularly concerned at the moment by the rise of the nationalists, of so-called populists. and they want to ensure, in a sense, safeguard the institutions of the EU from what could be a very, very destructive political split within the EU itself, within the European Parliament. So, yes, to an extent, this is an attempt to reassert the control and power of Berlin and Paris, as it was for much of the story of the European, what was then the EEC and then became the European Union. There's a further factor, of course, which is the loss of Britain. There was a power balance that was further established between Britain, France, and Germany inside the EU, with Britain to a large extent working with other smaller member states to often offset the Franco-German axis. That balance is now gone with Brexit, or whatever happens to Brexit, and therefore France and Germany are doing what states the world over do. When they see an opportunity to exert and extend their influence and power, that's what they do. Because, particularly in Germany, the Germans are always worried about where Germany's going and where Europe's going, for obvious reasons. And that nervosity, that angst, I think is the appropriate German word, tends to move them to want to control things. This is not some kind of German empire that I'm suggesting, but just because of a nervousness in the German body politic about Germany, its place in Europe, and the past. And so what we're seeing is, after years of drift and crisis and populism and failure, France and Germany essentially trying to exert some kind of grip over this project before it falls apart. Of course, the big problem therein is that the French and the Germans themselves do not agree about what the French call the finalité, where this thing should end up. The French are much more nationalistic in many ways than the Germans are, and are only willing to embed France within the European Union if it extends France. The Germans are desperate to have German power, and it is indeed German power embedded in the European project, but at the same time they want to have some control over it for what they say is the sake of Europe. Now, often when I hear France talk about Europe, it means more France. When I hear Germans talk about more Europe, it means a safe Germany. And that paradox has never been resolved at the heart of the project.
Plenty of sort of outsider economists keep making noise about how on the brink the German banking system is and the extent to which the French banking system is wound into this. Could what just happened be viewed simply as a way to stabilise what could be an economic disaster, even more than what could be a political disaster?
Well, I think the European Union has economic decline embedded within it because it simply prevents Europeans from becoming competitive. If I'm concerned about the banking sector, I'm much more concerned about the Italian banks than I am about the German or French banks. But there is an essential economic factor here, which is the Germans got rich because of the Eurozone. The Eurozone offset the cost of German productivity. And the one-size-fits-all interest rate, which was applied to all Eurozone members, led a lot of European countries to go on a splurge in the early noughties, which basically funded Germany's recovery. The Germans now have a massive surplus. The French have a large debt. The Italians have a massive debt, approaching 140% of GDP right now, of national debt. The result is that a lot of European countries, including the French, really want the Germans to use their surplus to write off those debts. Debt mutualization is called. The German taxpayer simply doesn't want to do it because they believe that they would be rewarding other Europeans because they're less organized and less efficient, and would embed inefficiency even further into the European project than is currently the case. So the big battle over the next few years will be the extent to which the French can persuade the Germans to use their surplus to fund projects beloved of the French, including a European army that will be basically an army of Europeans rather than a federated European force.
Well, that sounds really interesting, Julian, but reality of the situation is I don't see anything moving in that general direction. I mean, how are we going to see a common defense and security doctrine be forged in Europe when we have these fundamental problems underpinning the European project?
We're not. And that's one of the great crises of European defense. Well, I'm writing a book for Oxford right now on this very issue with two American generals. And the reason we're writing it is because, I've been in this business many, many years. And what I've observed is the weaker European forces become, the more acronyms we create to offset it. We don't actually invest in forces and resources as required to meet the challenge that is coming towards us. And you Australians look at the world beyond you, and there is a rapid change taking place. And much of it is dangerous change. The trouble with European defense is it got sucked into a much wider political debate about the future structure of Europe itself. Why? Because defense is the first and fundamental duty of the state to its citizens. If you federate the defense of Europe from the nation state to some European federal level, somewhat like the European defense community as planned back in the early 1950s, then effectively you're emaciating the European nation state critically. You are taking the final step to transfer critical authority from the state to the union. There are some in Germany who pretend they support this, but not many. The French certainly do not support it. The Central Eastern Europeans do not support it. So we go round and round in this circle of this struggle to find a balance between effectiveness, efficiency, and cost in European defense. Because of welfare programs in most European countries, particularly Western European countries, this is a particularly Western European crisis, most of these governments simply don't want to spend on security and defense what they should be spending given their relative GDPs if they properly assessed the threats to them. And that goes across the civil military spectrum from security to defense. So what they try to do is they try to get defense on the cheap by talking about a more federated European defense. But at the same time, they simply don't want to give up the sovereignty that a federated European defense would require. Hand power to some kind of security defense commissioner in the European Commission, as an example. So we end up in this defense trap in Europe, where the logical solution in many ways to produce defense outcomes that are affordable would be a more federated approach. But very few, if any, European states are willing to give up that kind of sovereignty to achieve it. The result is a kind of fragmented half and half mess, which doesn't really satisfy anybody.
Julian, is this likely to change now that the Russians are frightening Europeans to such a degree that national service is being brought back in places like Sweden? Will this change Europeans' perception of security and the recognition that individual states aren't willing to spend what it would cost to have high quality security, and there has to at least be some sort of compromise towards at least a better alliance shared security platform, or even the new fear and the return to national service won't transcend this problem?
Well, look where the return to limited conscription, and I've been in Stockholm many times discussing this, is taking place in Sweden. Look where there is efforts to improve the defense outcomes they generate. These are the Baltic states. My point is that there are some Europeans where they perceive the Russian threat more acutely that are willing to invest in these kind of decisions. And let's face it, in introducing conscription in any form, most liberal Western European societies or European societies is actually quite a high risk strategy for any politician. But then you go to Portugal, Spain, Italy, they'll tell you the Russians aren't a problem. The problem is the Middle East and North Africa, the stability therein. NATO finds itself trying to kind of balance those two with rhetoric about a 360-degree alliance. The simple truth is that some EU/NATO European members place Russia high on the threat assessment, others don't. And then you've got increasing influence of Chinese investment in certain southeastern European countries and southern European countries, which is also beginning to influence their political decision making over what choices they should make as to who a potential enemy is. So you are seeing profound divisions emerge within Europe over the very nature of threat and where indeed the focus of security and defense investment should be, given these states disagree over who the problem is.
And even then, NATO doesn't look like any kind of solution because, as you've pointed out, NATO is both getting pulled north and south and having to look potentially towards Russia, the Middle East and China and go, well, country I'm talking to today, who's your enemy of choice and what are you willing to be a part of? You end up with, at a minimum, a three-strategy alliance, which is just impossible.
Yes, and what tends to happen in those situations is coalitions emerge. And we're seeing that. If you were to ask me what is the most important security and defense transnational mechanism in the world right now, it's Five Eyes. It has the reach, it has the knowledge, it has the information, and it has power.
And continuity relative to everyone else.
Correct. I mean, look at the UK. I mean, the UK, the British Army, you could put the entire British Army inside Wembley Stadium right now. This is not a continental army designed to defend continental Europe. Britain's building new ballistic missile submarines with nuclear weapons on board, and it can hide behind its nuclear shield. It's building a new navy with aircraft carriers to work with the Americans elsewhere. It's not preparing to defend continental Europe in an emergency. That would fall mainly to the Germans, who don't want to do it. So NATO is increasingly desperate in its efforts to suggest to the Russians in particular that our deterrence, and it's all about deterrence, is credible. But any analysis of the force structures that are deployed in pursuit of deterrence suggests that is not the case, and the Russians fully understand that. My nightmare, to be blunt, is not the belief that Russia is about to invade a NATO or EU member state tomorrow. But they certainly could. They certainly could take the Baltic states if they wanted to, very quickly. The nightmare scenario for me is that a Russia that is economically no longer viable begins to collapse, and the regime, desperate for survival, and in Moscow it's all about regime survival, embarks on another military adventure. The more extreme the crisis at home in Russia, the greater the military adventure. The real checkmate, if you like, for NATO would be a Russian military which seized the Baltic states very quickly, then stopped.
Yeah, with nowhere else to go and no resources left.
Yeah. What are you going to do about it? Are you really prepared to go to nuclear war over the Baltic states? And the answer clearly is most Europeans would not. By the way, the Russians in that scenario wouldn't call Washington, they'd call Berlin. So, in a sense, we're getting dangerously close to kind of bluff deterrence, with the Americans being weakened the world over, trying to offset the weaknesses of their European allies. If NATO is to function as a credible deterrent and defense in the future, Europeans are going to have to up their game as first responders in a crisis. Because don't think for a minute that a crisis in Europe would also not be matched by a crisis in your neck of the woods, in Asia Pacific. There'll be multiple crises engineered the world over, overstretching the Americans to the point where they can't be effective in any one theater. So if the Europeans want to make NATO or keep NATO as the essential defense mechanism at the heart of their own defense concept, they have to build a force up that can be a credible first responder should the Americans be busy elsewhere. Right now, that is simply not the case.
This episode's musical interlude comes to you courtesy of Heartway, a local Adelaide duo who we've had on the show before. This week we're featuring their track Dreaming. That's Heartway with their track Dreaming. You're listening to Strategicon.
Yeah. You're the one. you're the one, you're the one. Yeah, you're the one, you're the one.
Dreaming by Heartway. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Strategicon. We're discussing the nuances of EU Parliament and what is needed for leadership in Germany.
I think there's another thing that we need to talk about, and that is transatlantic relations. I mean, we've now talked about NATO, and of course the United States is the key driver of NATO. But we also know that over the last, 12 to 18 months, relations between Washington and the European capitals have been on the nose. And this does have a knock-on effect from a political perspective in terms of, the belief that the alliance is going to come to the aid of Europe. Donald Trump obviously had a point in terms of his complaints about the Europeans not doing enough to help themselves out, which you've just confirmed. But, when we're looking at this situation and we're thinking of a solution, surely the solution has to come from the United States. I mean, the United States has to try to continue to nudge the Europeans in the direction that will be for the common good. I can't see it from what you're telling me. I can't see it coming from the European side.
I'm sure that's right. And the Americans wobble between overextension and isolation.
Yeah, they don't do in the middle, so why would they help the Europeans? They'll either dominate or walk away.
Well, the Americans paradoxically now need allies more than they've ever needed them, be they in Europe or in Asia Pacific. I call it the global West, the West as an idea rather than a place, a coalition of democracies centered on the United States. And the Americans are moving towards that kind of concept. The rise of China, the behavior of Russia, and indeed others, complicates America's strategic calculus massively. The Trump administration is right on the fundamentals of Europeans and their defense. They simply don't spend enough, do enough, think enough, or are creative enough to create a genuine defense outcome that is enabling the Americans to uphold their security guarantee to Europeans, or enabling Europeans to keep America strong where we need America to be strong. But, the world is changing, and it's not just about military power, it's about technology, it's about AI, it's about all these new technologies entering the security space, which further complicate, the public good that we're seeking to achieve by maintaining security and defense. But ultimately, the Europeans who complain about the Americans, and I should point out that the Americans under Trump have increased their assistance to Europeans under the European Deterrence Initiative compared with the Obama administration. The Americans, in practice, are not withdrawing from Europe, quite the reverse. They're investing in Europe. But what frustrates me when I hear some of the rhetoric from my fellow Europeans about the problem with President Trump and the Americans is that they're doing nothing serious to ease their addiction to American defense as their own essential defense. And let's face it, Europe is still addicted to American defense and the American taxpayer paying for it. So, my frustration over many years of being in this business, having worked with the EU and NATO, is that at some point Europeans have to get serious about this stuff. Otherwise, they are going to face one hell of a shock. And I'd rather plan to prevent such a shock rather than have to respond to it. But Europeans at the moment complain about the Americans but do nothing to offset their complaints or indeed generate the kind of influence that you would want to bring to Washington to prove you're a useful ally. And to be fair to the Brits, and we Brits these days are much more aligned about everything, apart from cricket, which we're good at, which you're not. You were once, but not anymore. We built these aircraft carriers, we're building these new ballistic missile submarines, we still have a deployable force, however small it might be. The thing about dealing with Washington, as I have for many years, is that you have to show that you can be useful to America. So that age of Atlanticism, that age of American internationalism, which grew up after World War II, is gone. If we Europeans want the Americans to pay for much of our defense, which is what we seem to want, then we're also going to have to up our game to enable the Americans to achieve that very end, because the Americans won't do it because of some misty-eyed nostalgia for some past NATO that probably never existed.
This is making me sort of think very historically to the fall of Rome. One of the biggest contributing factors was, Rome no longer did its own security. So, the Western Empire fell because it wouldn't do its own security. It outsourced. The Eastern Empire, which never stopped being at least moderately military competent, survived an extra 1,000 years before finally going under. It really does seem here that a natural split.
There are echoes of 4th century and 5th century Rome. I mean, in the sense of the Western Europeans are decadent, and they just are. We are. We're obsessed with internal politics, social welfare, minority rights, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's all you ever hear on the discourse these days. They're important things, but they're not, the fundamental purpose of statehood and statecraft. The Central Eastern Europeans are much more aware of the security realities that they face, much like the Eastern Empire.
Yeah, that's my parallel.
There is that parallel where the Rome did become decadent, and I see what I would call strategic illiteracy and decadence across most Western European capitals. And it's really caused by a political class that really doesn't want to deal with these issues. In the wake of the financial and banking crises of the late noughties, which perhaps had as great a strategic effect in shifting the balance of power as a lost war, but no one's really picked up on that. Maintaining social cohesion by finding sources of money to lavish on citizens has been the key to political success. And a lot of that money in many member states has come from defense. Because when you think that during the Cold War, even as late as the late 80s, Western European states were spending on average about 5% GDP on defense. They'd spent higher, 7-8% of GDP on defense for much of that effort period, and even that wasn't deemed enough by the Americans. Many of them, with Germany to the fore, are now finding it extremely difficult to fulfill their formal commitment at the September 2014 NATO Wales Summit to achieving 2% GDP on defense by 2024, of which 20% must be on new equipment every year. They made that formal commitment and they're now reneged on it. And this is 2%. This is a historically low figure. Some say to me, well, 2% is an arbitrary figure and what does it prove? Well, my argument would be, 2% spent well on defense is a damn sight better than 1% spent badly, which has been the case hitherto. And even the Brits are playing games with their defense budget to give the impression they're spending 2%. Even this week, the House of Commons Defence Select Committee in London demonstrated, as I have even 5 years ago, that in fact the Brits probably spend about 1.7, 1.8% GDP on defence. So they become obsessed with these pointless figures, when the real question Western Europeans should be asking themselves, and the key to the future of Europe and its defence is Western Europe, because it has the power and the wealth still to do that, is what are the defence outcomes we need to generate? What is the deterrence we need to generate, the defence we need to generate? What would it look like with all the new technologies? And given that, how much would it cost and how best to afford that outcome? And I see none of that strategic logic being applied to Europe's increasing defense dilemma.
Do you think that there's a possibility? I mean, we were talking about the likelihood of centrifugal forces pulling things apart from a strategic level in Europe. But do you think that there's a possibility that, in the medium term, we're going to start seeing radical power shifts in Europe where the security paradigm simply fragments into regionalist blocks? One of the things that I can say here is that, we were talking about the fact that America is investing in Europe, but we haven't been talking about where America has been investing in Europe. It's really been investing in Eastern Europe. It's been investing in the Baltics. It's been investing in Poland, in Hungary, and Romania as the front line against the Russians. But the true investment further toward the German area, the Italian area, it's not similar by any stretch, is it?
No, but then why should the American taxpayer subsidize the German, Italian, French, British, or other taxpayer? These are top 6 or 7 world economies. These people can afford defense. They just choose not to. And that's the essential American frustration. The Germans choose not to afford a sound defense. And they are the heart of continental defense of Europe. The British are beginning to do it again. But under Philip Hammond as Chancellor, Britain's been a balance sheet rather than a country. France talks big, delivers little. And as for Italy, I love the country, did my PhD there. It's a wonderful place, but it's led by idiots. And that is sorry, but that's the reality. History will judge them as such. And it's this almost systemic free riding and lack of seriousness, strategic seriousness, which in a way is almost a kind of 21st century form of appeasement. They just don't want to address these issues because it's all too difficult domestically.
Well, it is, though.
No, it's not all too difficult. This is to go back to this strategic illiteracy thing. Mrs. von der Leyen, when she was giving her speech when she was elected about what matters to her, was the most politically correct, tertiary issues, nothing primary, nothing about security, nothing about a genuinely functional economy, nothing that you could hang your future on. It was all assuming that you can have a nice sunny day in cloud cuckoo land. It was profound.
All right. Gentlemen, I have to say something here. I have got some German blood coursing through my veins, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. How much of what we're seeing at the moment really is a reverberation of post-World War II trauma that's still being played out? German guilt is one of the greatest impediments to Germany ever becoming a normal nation ever again. And many people, and including myself, would say quite rightly so. But you can't have it both ways. You can't have the largest, most powerful country in Europe taking a predominantly militant stand, even if it is for the good of Europe, even if it is embedded within a collective defense, because it gives Germany back a stature that all European countries didn't want Germany to have. So you can't go there.
Yeah, but there's a third part to that. If you don't want them to have it, then you have to do it.
Well, all right. Okay, that's a good question, Julian. Why not would be, for instance, the Brits would, the British political establishment won't necessarily see it in its interest to see a very powerful Germany dominating the continent, which it will. The French, I don't know. Well, it does economically, but if you give the Germans their Wehrmacht back, I think that you'll find European attitudes would change against Germany, and you'll end up breaking up the entire European security structure as it's currently structured.
Yeah, but it doesn't have a security structure. It has to pay the Americans to protect it.
I hear what you say, but I'm part of a thing called the Lindley-French group, which is a high-level US-German strategic group. Don't ask me why I'm a member of it, but I am. It's Munich Security Conference and George C. Marshall Center with both governments behind it. I think you're doing modern Germany a deep injustice to what you say. Modern Germany is not Nazi Germany. It is not the Wehrmacht. It is not the Luftwaffe of old. And, I remember getting myself in trouble years ago in a piece in the Herald Tribune when I was working for the European Union Institute for Security Studies by saying, for 50 years, we told you, Germans, you couldn't do anything because of World War II. And for the last 10 years, you Germans have been telling us, you can't do anything because of World War II. Well, that was then, this is now. I trust modern Germany. I have no problem with modern Germany playing its commensurate security and defense role. I know most senior German officers, some of whom are close friends. These are These are not. This is not the SS reborn. So my sense is that there can be no European defence of any meaningful weight unless the Germans do match that 2% GDP on defence to which they agreed. Second, even during the Cold War, the Bundeswehr was the major defence force in Western Europe, the land force. And third, it's time. It doesn't mean for a minute the Germans are going to forget their history. They're not, believe me, nor are we. But I, as a Brit, and I can speak for many of my fellow Europeans, we have no real problem with Germany fulfilling its wider responsibilities as a leader of Europe. It's a fact, and it's a good leader of Europe. What many of us have a problem with is Germany free riding and getting cheap defence and using that cheapness to become a mercantilist power that moves away from the responsibilities of leadership. Germany, we need German leadership in Europe. And modern Germany, to my mind, is absolutely no threat. Even Polish colleagues of mine feel the same. So, if anything, we see the opposite. You go back to the von der Leyen speech. This was strategic political correctness at its worst.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's that political correctness. It's that refusal to face realities in favour of some short-term virtue signalling, which is doing so much damage to European, not just defence, but society, because it leaves millions of decent, ordinary Europeans alienated by this language. And the result is you end up with frustrated people voting for populists who offer no solutions. And you have a defence system which is more words than action. The European mainstream elite, with Germany at its core, has led us Europeans into a corner. And we can only get out of that corner, to my mind, if we start looking at the world as it is, not as the world as we would like it to be. And that will require a profound political shift. Maybe the shock of Brexit, if it ever happens, will start us down that road. But I don't see much sign of it yet.
I think that you touch on a major point here, and that is the division between the political classes in Europe and the military that is their instrument, whether it's for sovereign defense or collective defense. But, they speak a different language. They're almost like an alien overlord over the European militaries combined. You've got military officers who are frothing at the bit, wanting to have a role that is useful to the collective defense of Europe, and then you have a political class that just doesn't want to play.
No, I think there is truth in that. All the senior officers I know are simply professionals. They do the job the politicians tell them to do. Yes, they're frustrated that they haven't got more resources. They also know that militaries have a tendency to want more resources, whatever you give them. So they understand there must be limits. But it's simply gone too far the other way. It's gone to the point now where readiness levels of many European forces are laughable in terms of the threat they face. The ability to move decisive force where you need it in a crisis doesn't exist. Exercises take place in which the German military has to use broomsticks because they can't afford barrels for their guns on tanks. I mean, this is nonsense. This is appeasement. History will condemn this. And to suggest that a simple correcting, I'm not suggesting you're suggesting this, but a simple correction to re-establish a credible, sound, basic defense is some kind of militarization of Germany or Europe. It's simply not the case. We're fast in danger of becoming neo-pacifists. And in this world, you make the world more dangerous, not less secure, less dangerous, when you simply try to opt out of reality.
We've got very similar problems here, I think, Julian, and that is strategic literacy is probably at the lowest level it has been since World War II in the political elite. We see the same implications from Bush Jr. through Obama in the US. It's a bit hard to tell what goes on with Trump, whether strategic illiteracy is the problem or just illiteracy. But either way, the discussion in civil military affairs that seems to be needed, but no one seems to know how to start it, is how do you then enhance strategic literacy in your political elite again? So in some ways, von der Leyen being a defence minister should be a positive towards enhancing strategic literacy within the political elite. It doesn't seem that's the case. Who in Europe could put forward candidates with that literacy? Are there any obvious parties or sections of the parliament that are more grounded in this literacy? So here in Australia, we have two former serving officers who are about the only strategic literacy in our parliament.
I think, you point to a real dilemma, a real problem. And there are people within all parliaments who are willing to listen to this stuff. I mean, one thing I would do is get many more politicians involved in major exercises, playing the roles that they would play in government.
And get them to have the practice, yeah.
They would start to see, I remember in the past, British ministers used to play the role of unleashing the British nuclear forces in a scenario. That certainly focused the mind on how you stop such things happening in the first place. And I've been plugging away at this for 30 years and failed to do so because there hasn't been the mood, particularly in the wake of the Cold War. There is this kind of Cold War lag where Europeans still believe that the peace to end all pieces has been achieved with the end of the Cold War and don't really want to wake up to that new reality. As I say, all that one can really do is keep pushing solutions to them that make them look good. And I've had several cases in my career where I've offered ideas which have been picked up because they are politically useful. And at the same time, have those politically useful ideas part of a longer set of ideas, which means the politician can both benefit in the short term electorally, which is all they tend to be worried about, but the country can benefit strategically over the medium to long term, or the group or the coalition, whatever. And that needs people like yourselves, myself, to be a lot less lost in the upper atmosphere of academia and much more focused on the practical delivery of policy. And I have seen, I'm so bored with think tanks in Europe, not all of them, there's some very good ones, and academics in Europe coming up with these harebrained schemes which will, basically get them a promotion inside their respective institutions, but offer no solutions to European defence. We have to offer ideas that can be used.
How much of the lack of literacy is also just a reflection on the public, for instance? I can't imagine there would be too much social hunger for a much more militant Germany. This is a very progressive youth, let's say.
No one wants a militant.
Apologies.
He wants a common sense Germany.
Well, let's just say we want a Germany that's capable of maintaining its own security and helping others to do the same.
But is it illiteracy on the public's behalf? Because is it political suicide to kind of come out as a German politician and say, actually, we need some common sense here? Is it the public that's neo-pacifist?
That's called leadership. I mean, most ordinary people don't know squat about this stuff. And nor should they. Their lives are tough enough as it is, surviving from week to week, month to month. But they'll listen to a leader who explains to them why this has to be done in their name. And you'll get some on the extremes, and the extremes have far too much influence these days, screaming from left and right about this and that. But if a responsible leader like Chancellor Merkel went on to German TV, or someone who was responsible in the UK or France, or Macron in France, and said, look, we would like to spend more on social welfare, health services, etc., etc., etc. But as your leader, our assessment is that we face a growing threat, and therefore we need to invest more across the range of security and defence. My sense is the massive majority of citizens would say, okay, understood, get on with it. I was curious, when HMS Queen Elizabeth, one of the first of the new aircraft carriers, sailed into Portsmouth, the massive public support for it. And why? Because this was the unheard majority saying this is right. What you tend to hear far too often in these debates are extremists on left and right, and they warp this sense of who the public is. The massive majority of ordinary citizens are willing to be led as long as they're well led. And their frustration is that they haven't been well led, and they've got right to be frustrated here in Europe over that, particularly on issues of life and death. A growing sense of unease that somehow the politicians simply don't get it. So I go back to my point. It's about leadership that drives public opinion. the number of times I've heard and reacted to senior European politicians saying, yes, but the European public opinion would not allow this. It's your job to lead that public opinion, not simply try and follow it.
So, Julian, being rather skeptical about politics generally, whether it be here, Europe, or anywhere else, I tend to think that politicians are very conservative creatures, and it will take a crisis of a certain magnitude for them to force themselves out of their comfort zone and confront some of the pressing issues of the day. Do you think that the only thing that will save Europe in the end is a crisis of some magnitude?
It'll either save it or destroy it. Depends on the nature of the crisis and its magnitude. Certainly, in my mind, the mediocrity, I call it the mediocrity of Brussels, and indeed many European capitals, particularly Western European capitals, seems at present unable to cope with big change. It's built on incremental negotiation within the EU itself. There are people within those bodies politics, who do have the talent and one would hope would emerge. But in a sense, we have a political class that is the product of many years of relative peace. And maybe some kind of shock would be required to drive them in this direction. What concerns me is their mediocrity is such that the relevant and requisite shock would be of such enormity as to be a disaster. And I don't want a disaster to be the galvanizing factor in Europe's return to defense realism. I want Europeans to work it out for themselves together. And if it takes France and Germany to lead, although they can't get anywhere without the Brits, who are Europe's strongest military power and will remain so, then so be it. I think the others will then follow. But the real weakness in that triumvirate is right now not Britain, but in fact Germany. And if Germany took that leadership step and had the courage to so do it, then not only would it make European defense credible, it would restore credibility to the alliance, to NATO, and start to rebuild the transatlantic relationship. But as one very senior German said to me the other day in Berlin, not this chancellor and not this president. And I fear that's correct.
So is the European security architecture worth saving? I mean, having said everything, having put all our cards on the table here, and knowing that it's going to take a great effort to try to bring realism back to the European table, is it even worth saving? Or do we just let it fail and recombobulate itself in another form, which probably would be a bit more rational?
It's going to be like the famous old soldier. It won't die; it will just fade away.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, in a real crisis, do you think for the moment the Americans would go to NATO to run this crisis? No. The Americans would ring up London, Paris, and Berlin in that order, and they will say, "Right, chaps, guys, this is what we're going to do," and then they will go to NATO. Even now, the institutional shape of European defense has nothing to do with what would happen in a crisis. It would be run by the big capital. So it's already got a kind of, how can I put it, information sharing exercise rather than doing mechanism at its heart. I sometimes think that NATO these days is more about preparing summit declarations than actually running the defense and deterrence of the alliance. So it's already happening. The Americans would not be for a moment constrained by a war by committee through NATO, the North Atlantic Council. If the war lasted longer than 30 days, and I'm using the scenario of a war with Russia to the east, then they might turn to NATO for what happens thereafter. And they would be running NATO in parallel to get things like forced mobilization and readiness for the majority of the NATO command structure. Well, that initial engagement would be run by the Americans with their major allies, and it would not be run through institutions.
What would happen in a situation like that, Julian, with the East Europeans, the Poles, the Czechs, who understand the significance of security, would be more willing to put their money, blood and treasure, where their mouth is and do something? Would there be a way to draw them in very quickly, or does that have to then wait for the phase of engaging NATO and going through the mechanistic process?
Well, there are exercises that take place, American-led exercises with certain elements of these countries, and they all have one or two useful formations which they could then use. I mean, east of Germany and Austria, all these countries, Visegrad countries, the Baltic states, the Southeast European countries, they're all acutely aware, given their histories, of Russia and its tendencies. So they're already more acutely attuned to what would be needed than Western Europeans, or many Western Europeans. So I think they'd be very open to American leadership. In fact, they are. I mean, if you look at the way America runs exercises, when they take place, these countries are all contributing to it. The trouble is their magnitude, with the exception of the Poles, is small.
Yeah.
And even the Poles are not that big. I heard some suggestion that post-Brexit, the Poles will replace the UK. Not a hope. The orders of magnitude with the UK and the Polish are unfortunately, with due respect, and I admire them greatly, is a massive difference.
It's more that the Poles are available on the continent already, and that if the phone call can come and they can go, at least you've got competent, willing people.
And they would, as for the Baltic states, they would probably fight the Russians in a very different way that NATO thinks they would fight.
Yeah,
they'd fight them in the woods.
Yeah, they'd learn all the lessons from Afghanistan and stuff, and repeat that. Yeah,
I mean, there's a very good book written by General Sir Richard Shirreff called War with Russia in 2017. I was Richard's head of his Commanders Initiative Group when he was commander of the ARC, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, and it's a novel. But he pretty much lays it out what would happen in that book, in such a scenario. And it's a good book. You should read it. And, I had a long conversation with Richard about these issues. He became DSACR as well. So, yeah, there is the kind of institutional parlor game of European defense. Then there is the hard power reality of American leadership.
Well, look, we're close to closing up our podcast. Julian, is there anything that you'd like to actually mention that you haven't mentioned so far with regard to the status of Europe's security?
I think we've covered most of the bases. Looking forward, I want to build on what the findings of the NATO adaptation report that I wrote with General Allen, Ambassador Vershbau, Ambassador Balacek, and General Langheld and Admiral Di Paola a year and a half ago, that we established an agenda of adaptation that is established clearly on the nature of emergent threats, that looks to strike a balance between efficiency, effectiveness, and legitimacy of force in Europe, that understands the place of Europeans in America's global role, and understands the role of Europeans in enabling America to maintain the security and defense of Europe, and above all, begins to look at the revolution in military technology that's underway and how that can be applied to deterrence and defense. Without that kind of systematic strategic analysis and thereafter plans of action to recalibrate and modernize defense and deterrence in Europe, then I foresee this continued drift as forces get ever smaller and acronyms get ever more, as we invent more words than more forces. And to my mind, that would be a tragedy, because it makes the world, not just Europe, a more dangerous place. And it reflects a complete lack of strategic responsibility on the part of Europe and its leaders. And that needs to change urgently.
Yes, indeed it does. Anyway, Julian, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you being on Strategicon this time round.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julian.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you could subscribe to Strategicon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.